Hello, and welcome back to our podcast, Caring for Mothers Around the World, a series, episode 2. I'm Christina.
And I'm Maya.
And in our last episode, we started talking about maternity leave as a concept, primarily in the West, specifically the United States. And today we're going to go into more of how these policies have come about, but also what maternity leave looks like in different parts of the world, and how do different economies and societies around the world support like maternity issues with maternity. So oftentimes in socialist and welfare states like those in Europe and some Asian countries, similar to the U.S., women are given at least more than 6 weeks of paid maternity leave as part of healthcare and civil rights for mothers. But maternity leave does look very different in different countries. It is more maternity leave than family leave, and much less so paternity leave, as the latter is, again, a definitely much more Western concept that many countries have not adopted. An article that I found literally titled, Why Developing Countries Need Maternity Leave. Now, in light of all the research that we've done, it does come off as very tone deaf because there can be issues with this, going back to transnational feminism, which caters to addressing the different needs of different groups of women and recognizing that not every group has the same needs. So, more than 70% of working women, according to this article, do not have maternity leave. Only 28% are fully protected with time off and full pay, like globally. And I believe in the article that you mentioned, even women who get maternity leave, some countries only give like 67% of their original salary when they get this time off.
Exactly. And some only get like 33%, some 90%, and a few and really a handful get 100%. But it depends on where you live, and there's huge ranges based on salaries.
Yeah, that's no bueno. Because even in countries where there is maternity leave, like we talked about, here in the United States, it's mostly for women in the formal working sector. And again, the majority of women, not just in this country, but in the world, are not a part of this sector. So that's a really important fact that we just need to keep repeating to ourselves, because we need to remember that the women reflected in these statistics are not representative of all the women in these countries that they take these data pools in. And that's not including the many countries left out of the data pool entirely. So we're missing a huge chunk of the population that their needs are being overlooked because their entire existence is being overlooked. In Kenya, they have laws that provide women with 3 months of maternity leave, but many cases companies don't adhere to that. A lot of it, it's based on their own policies, without regulation. So it doesn't adhere to that. And casually employed women, so those who are part-time, self-employed with their own businesses, they're not entitled to these benefits. And that's similar, to the United States. So women have to juggle working and taking care of their children, as well as breastfeeding, because some of them do breastfeed, which is another important factor that has a negative stigma in the formal working sector, despite being a natural process that follows, childbirth. So, in South Africa, domestic workers are eligible for maternity benefits because they are covered by their basic labor laws in the country. So this includes paid leave, overtime, severance, notice of dismissal, and a written contract with their employer. Brazilian constitution grants women 120 days of maternity leave without prejudice to jobs or wages. And in Gabon, a pregnant woman can ask the labor inspector to examine the work she's doing before she goes on this maternity leave to ensure that it's not too strenuous for her. And if it's found too dangerous, she can be asked to be moved to a different position without loss of pay, and 3 months after she returns maternity leave. So it looks very different depending on where you go. It's not, it wouldn't be accurate to try and make a generalized mandated policy, because it looks so different, in every country, and it's also carried out differently in every country. So despite it sounds really good, all these policies, it sounds really progressive, but the percentage of women eligible for these benefits in a lot of these, still developing countries, it does little to uplift these groups because it's still disproportionate to the women excluded from the formal working sector. Those women who are not in this sector, they don't, they're not eligible for to receive these benefits from these policies. So several groups are excluded or poorly protected. This includes, the private sector compared to the public sector, rural
Yeah.
workers compared with urban ones, agriculture, the informal economy, domestic or home workers, migrant workers, part-time,
Mhm.
casual time, temporary workers, workers in small businesses or family businesses, self-employed independent workers. So the question then goes to, is the general policy of maternity leave that we talked about in the United States in the last episode applicable to these women? Like, does it address their needs because their living conditions, society, and culture is very different from ours?
For sure. I I don't think it would apply, and
Yeah.
I definitely think that it's because it's called maternity leave that it's hard to picture in these settings with rural workers, and many of them are day workers who go get their everyday bread from their jobs. So if you're a woman who is pregnant, what are you going to do? You shouldn't be working these jobs, but also they're not going to pay you to take leave from these jobs.
Yeah.
So at that point, I think it's always tied back to the economy, maybe of the country. And there's always something that communities can do. So, a lot of welfare states do have some community outreach. And if you're a woman who's pregnant and you have citizenship in that country, you're entitled to that care. And I've read an article about Cuba's welfare state policies, and they always put a high priority on their medical staff. And that influences a lot of how they treat women who are pregnant because most of their economy is actually made up of marketing their medical expertise.
Yeah.
So many rural Cuban women and at risk mothers who are 6 weeks from their due date can go to a maternity home in order to stay healthy during this process.
Hmm.
And they're allowed to go to these centralized hospitals to get the medical care for the 6 weeks before and about 4 to 6 weeks after giving birth. And instead of the US, which can't seem to give insurance policies to anybody,
Mm.
Cuba at least gives the basic needs for women during that period, like that very critical period.
Yeah.
And I feel like they grasp what it means to take care of mothers at that time. It's not that they give paid leave, but they take care of them during that critical time of pregnancy. And there's still a lot of problems in Cuba's economy in general, but the fact that we vilify them for being such a different culture just enforces this idea of capitalism. And that fact is what we should be looking at new ideas like Cuba has that might actually work in the US or in other countries. But as you said before, not all sizes fit. And definitely the US policy of maternity leave might not apply in Cuba.
Yeah. Again, it's very obvious when you look at that, what the priorities are in this country compared to other countries. We always like market ourselves as the richest country in the world because our economy, thrives off of, being a capitalist economy. But the reality is that the quality of life for women is not as high as we would like it to be compared to other socialist countries. Again,
Yeah.
the S word. You look at, Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, they all have higher quality of life for women, and they consistently rank higher for the best countries for women in particular to live in.
Mm,
Not every country is perfect. Every country has, like parts that like always could use more work and more reform, and they may not have as high as GDP compared to the US. But what's the trade-off? They have a higher quality of life for half their population, and everyone overall, because women feel more protected and secure in the formal and informal working sectors, and that's just as important because that's not the case here. And again, it's telling what our economy prioritizes regarding their for-profit agenda at the
mm,
expense of half the population's livelihood.
for sure, yeah. I definitely remember reading an article by the World Economic Forum, and they had said that they use a gender gap index,
Hmm.
which is a standardized index used by the CSW for the UN, or the Committee on the Status of Women.
We looked at that at our weekly readings.
Exactly. And it showed that like Scandinavian countries and Icelandic countries regularly hit the top of that list.
Yep.
And I mean, there were one or two things that they could reform, and there will never be like this perfect utopian haven. If there was, we wouldn't be called the human race.
Exactly.
And there's definitely so much room to improve. There's already basic steps recommended by the UNCSW and by all the forums that take place every year that no one actually heeds. So it comes to women and maternity. I feel like because they're so vulnerable, we should be paying attention to them more, and it should be more of an imminent problem, not something that we can lump together with all the other problems related to women and label them as gender related. We should really try and dive into these more marginalized and more at-risk groups of women.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even still, the overall priorities of these third world countries are different. You know, the way that
Mhm.
they live their lives is very different. And they are still touched by the effects of colonialism and capitalism by our country, by the United States. And that only works to further exacerbate inequality for working women. You know, the
Yeah.
like we've learned throughout this whole semester, like the modernization and the restructuring of traditional economies, this often increases the disadvantages, you know, that these women suffer because the modern sector takes over their economic activities that like help them survive, like food processing and you know making clothes. And you know, for the longest time, that's how these women from these countries supported themselves and their families. You know, they can compare their quality of life to ours, but the way that they live their lives is fundamentally different. Thus, their
Mhm.
development is different, and the needs that they require are essentially going to be different. But for us as a country to try and impose our own agenda through exploitation and outsourcing of labor and you know forcing our modernization onto them when they didn't ask for it, that's very damaging and it affects their livelihood. You know how they make their money and how they support themselves and their family. And even when they create new jobs in these countries, you know they don't go to the women. They are these new and better paid jobs. They primarily go to the men, and even
Yeah.
so that income is less likely to be spent on the family. So you know the modernization of agriculture, that has altered the division of labor
Mhm.
between the sexes because it increases the women's dependent status, you know, on their work and as well as increasing their workload. So they lose control over their resources, you know, like land, and they're being left alone more to support the children. And you know, in these countries, women carry double, even triple the workload. You know, the burden with housework, childcare, trying to secure paid employment, all while working longer hours than men and being paid less than them.
Mhm.
So going back to the double-edged sword, where it's like, here, women, you wanted to work, we have work for you, you know, but you're gonna work more. You're still expected to be home in time to take care of the children, and you're gonna be
Mhm.
working in lower paying jobs with longer hours compared to your male counterparts. So yeah,
Oh.
it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, but it's really telling again about what really needs to be changed.
Yeah, it all goes back to that idea of domestic labor that we touched on a little bit. And we often don't think of domestic labor like washing dishes or doing laundry or anything else as having to do with living in a house. And in the US we expect it to be fairly easy with all the mechanizations that have
Mhm.
come about and that were made to help women stay at home, I'd say, and make it less problematic about for women to stay at home, so they don't complain as much about doing the house chores. But these women who don't live in the US and who don't have regular access to electricity and all of these various technologies and technological advances, their work is so much more excruciating and cumbersome. So we often trivialize that work that these women do in other third world countries. And every time I go to India, my mom tells me like I have to start washing clothes by myself because there's not a clothes washer where I live at that time. So I was like, oh God, here it goes again. And it's super hot in India, so you're not just going to wash your clothes once every 2 days. No, it's going to be every day.
Oh
You're
my
going to
God.
be washing and hanging those clothes and taking them down all by yourself every day.
That's so painful to even think about. Oh my gosh. That is a really good point though that you're bringing up. The technology aspect is really important to this conversation that we haven't touched on until now.
Hmm.
I went to Colombia last year, during COVID. I was there for like a few days and then because the country was shutting down, we had to leave early. But I hadn't been to Colombia in about 10 years. So when I went back, I was in one of the nicer cities, but even as modernized as that city was, the
Hmm.
majority of the country is still like it's still I wouldn't want to say poor, but it is a much more, like simple way of living and much more rooted in, rural, you know,
Hmm.
settings and agriculture. But right next door to us is Venezuela, and their economy is in the toilet, absolutely. And it is all I was hearing was just how much more dangerous it is for women to be in those countries because they're always the most vulnerable, and they will always have less access to resources like technology. We don't think about that because in our country, we have always had steady, consistent access to the most rapidly advancing technology, and it
Hmm.
has its benefits, but it's only so easily accessible for us because it's produced from the exploitation of foreign and domestic labor. And we get
Hmm.
these from outsourcing from third world countries. So we exploit their labor, but we also don't give them the access to these resources that can help them get ahead when they are forced to modernize through colonialism and capitalism again.
Hmm.
So making sure that these needs for these women need to be addressed because these lump sum like fix it all solutions, they won't work for them because that's not what their situations call for. That's very much the Western patriarchal feminism not working for these groups in different countries.
For sure. And I guess moving away from the US concept of family and family living, I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-generational households, which are becoming more prevalent in the US, I have to say, but are more staple and common in the Asian continent, in Latin America, in the African continent.
Yeah.
And these multi-generational households, they're eh, I don't live in one right now, even though I'm Asian, and most white people of this country don't live in one. And for sure, that's far from our mind, from like the typical white American capitalist way of doing things, because everyone wants to buy a house and live alone and pay for their own things, etc. That's like just how the culture raises you. But
Yeah.
multi-generational households with grandparents or even teenage pregnancies all feed into a different culture that we don't understand, and that affects their maternity and maternal depression rates and their general quality of life, because in many cases younger grandparents tend to take care of the kids when they're born. And I know my cousin, who lives in a multi-generational household in India, lives with his grandma. And early on, when he was like 2, my grandparents would take care of him when his parents went to work. And I know my grandparents took care of me in my first couple of months, and same with my sister,
Yeah.
just so my parents could go out and work.
Yeah.
And it's so ingrained into Eastern concepts that in this article I had read, they were talking specifically about Chinese parents and how grandparents were helping the parents parent per se. And this leads to like a more robust family structure for them,
Yeah.
especially when they can agree on how to raise the children. On the other hand, it can lead to greater stress for mothers because they now have more domestic work with another person living in the house. And they have to take care of them as well if, like, say, the grandparent has health problems. So that expectation increases, especially with daughter in laws. And because of these multi-generational households, women have a lot more to consider on their plate, but it does lead to more family support in general. And that kind of maternity leave we don't talk about in the US. And
Yeah.
there's very little in ways of research and therapy and etc. and like Planned Parenthood around multi-generational families. As they say in many countries, it takes a village to raise a kid.
Yeah, my mom, she loves that phrase. I have heard her say it my entire life.
Same
Um,
with
she
mine.
she never backed away from, admitting that she would not have been able to raise me as a single mom,
Mhm.
she never, said that she did it on her own.
Mm.
And I think that's really important because this country is very individualistic as
Oh,
much as
sure.
it can be. And my mom had no problem saying that, oh no, if I didn't have like your grandparents to help me, like I don't know what I would have done. Because it's
Mhm.
really hard. It's She grew up with a single mom for most of her adult life. And I'm growing up with a single mom for most of my life so far. So that definitely ties back to what we talked about in the first episode with gender essentialism, where women are
Mhm.
conditioned from practically birth to be the caretaker. And even after they have their own kids, they're also expected to take care of their parents when they become grandparents. At least like that's definitely prevalent in my culture. So my mom has reflected that, she has two older brothers, and they do not do as much as her to take care of her mother, and that she naturally feels like inclined, like that it's her responsibility to take care of her, despite living the farthest away from like my grandmother compared to her siblings. She's like 50 minutes away. Everyone else is like 10 to 20.
Jeez.
So yeah, it's definitely she reflects on that a lot, and I'm not sure she understands that, it doesn't have to be that way.
No, it doesn't. It's really interesting actually because in the Bengali culture, I'd say it's almost the opposite.
Mm.
So my mom and her sister live pretty far away from like my grandma, and when you give away your daughter in marriage, it's like she's gone. She's no longer part of the family and you can't take her back. She belongs to the in-laws' families now.
Wow.
And at that point, you don't have to take care of your parents. And that's why parents in India are like gunning for sons. I have no idea where the idea that a son will take care of the parents came from, but that's pretty much central. And so my uncle lives with my grandma and takes care of her most of the time. Like my mom and my aunt only give suggestions over WhatsApp. And so that's like how it works.
That is so interesting. That is, in my at least in my experience, definitely the opposite in Hispanic culture. I am an only child, so that's how I grew up. But I know from my male cousins, because I'm the youngest, so they're are all significantly older than
Mm.
me. When I would go to Colombia and Puerto Rico, it was like I knew from the start, men are revered from the moment they are out of the womb. I don't understand why. They are treated as kings. They are not expected to do none of it, like if at all, like any of the housework, if especially
Mhm.
if they have sisters in the house, even if they're
Mhm.
younger. And my mom would always tell me to try to make me feel bad about me complaining about the little work that I have. But she would always say that when she was growing up and her two older brothers, went off to college and she was home, they were not expected to clean when they came home to visit, every few weekends. But whenever my mom came home to visit when she was away at school, she was expected to clean a house that she had not been in, so a house that
Mhm.
she did not dirty. So she was, but she was always expected to be there Saturday morning to clean it. So it's definitely common in immigrant households that you take care of your parents as soon as you get married, especially as a daughter when you marry someone. My grandma had it in her head that when my mom got married, she was going with my mom. They were like my mom was gonna have her husband move into the house that my grandma bought. And she was very disappointed when my mom said, that is not what's going to happen. I am moving out as fast as I
Mhm.
possibly can. But that's what like my grandma expected out of my mom. And, it wasn't expected of her older brothers to do that. When they moved out, they were like, it's like what you just said, but the opposite. When they move out, they're gone. They're gone.
Mhm.
So she was my mom being the only daughter and the youngest.
Mhm.
She was seen as like the only suitable future caretaker for my grandma. And when I went to Colombia, I had like this. I saw this from my own eyes because we stayed with my step grandma. That's the norm in that culture. A woman's main priority was marriage, and eventually raising children, as well as being able to like expected to take care of her parents. But again,
Mm-hmm.
different lifestyles, they equate to different needs. And I wish that there was more discourse and research on this because, that's another pressing issue that needs to be addressed when we have these like critical conversations. We need to dive more into these perspectives and, shine a light on these people who they have stories to share, but they haven't been given the space to share it. And I don't think these general policies that we talked about in the first episode with the United States, like they would have been as effective for my grandma. She worked in factories with various
Mm-hmm.
types of hours and working conditions in the informal sector. She was, I think, she was documented, but she wasn't like a full citizen. I think she just had residency for a while.
Yeah.
And then, back in Colombia, the majority of the workers work in the service sector. So
Mm-hmm.
in more industrialized cities, there's a formal working sector with sufficient pay and benefits attached to corporate jobs. But, in a lot of other countries, the majority of workers are just not part of the sector and they don't deserve to be left out just because they're not as high up in the formal working sector compared to other countries.
Yeah. I know for sure in India, women aren't expected to work once they marry. Like,
It's
they
fascinating.
always do solely domestic work.
Yeah.
And I think in like very few areas they have women actually work, which would be in like rural settings and tending to the fields and stuff like that. And obviously in more urbanized settings, which are influenced by like colonialistic thought. So
Yeah.
women work there and they tend to be in corporate settings mostly. So a lot of women who are in these fields, like in Assam, which makes Assam tea, many of them work and pick tea leaves, and it's very much a rural practice that women work like that.
Hmm.
So I can't imagine how much work they do, and I don't know how often they work when they're pregnant. On top of that, um, so that's like part of the problem, that we can't contextualize a lot of the rural women who are pregnant and how much they work. And because there's so little research and so little discussion, as we said in the last episode, um, and most of this research is actually based off of Western ideas of capitalism and the private sector when it comes to maternity leave. So it's so much harder to know like what it's like outside of the US, outside of Western thought, and how we should approach that and contextualize it maybe with numbers,
Yeah.
for women in the West.
Yeah. I'm reflecting back on like all the research we've done, and I think these blogs and these articles and case studies that focus on feminism around the world with maternity leave and new mothers and children in these third world countries, they always say that, like, back to that article, why they need maternity leave, and they focus mostly on the children. Their
Mm-hmm.
focus will always be directed towards the children because they see them as more vulnerable, essentially more valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And, it is true that newborns require, a lot of constant, undivided attention and care during their crucial time of development, but they're not addressing the needs of the mothers with the same rigor. And that bothers me. That will never sit right with me.
Mm-hmm. That's actually like part of the anxiety that mothers have. And especially when they're pregnant, they think that everybody's taking care of them because they're going to give birth to a baby who they'll eventually take care of.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why we go into depression during maternity leave. Everyone is worrying about the baby and no longer the woman. And I
Yeah.
actually was watching a TV show called Birth Care Center. And
Oh my God.
it's
Oh no.
hilarious. It makes a comedy of the working woman, and as she's super like high up in the ranks, but then she gets pregnant and all these things break out and happen to her, and it looks at like how her in-laws and how her mother react to her pregnancy before birth and after birth. And I think it's something you should really look into, especially episode one. It's really telling about like the experience that this woman had, especially after, where everybody was only like coddling the baby and her mother was the only one who actually took care of her.
That is so telling. I think that's too real. I can't watch that.
It
Oh
is
my God.
It is kind of real.
Damn. Oh my goodness. Yeah, for sure. I think at least I hope. I think the overall sentiment is that no woman wants to be looked at as just a baby making factory where it's
Hmm.
like you did your job, you popped out a baby, now it's time to go back to work. Like that's
Hmm.
very negative. And I feel
Sure.
at least one of the reasons why statistically women are having less children, later on
Mm-hmm.
compared to 30 years ago. I see articles about that every day where it's like
Hmm.
less and less women are having children, or more women are holding back on having children until they're emotionally ready for it. We really need to realign our priorities within our government, but also with understanding the experience of what it means to be a mother and to give birth. And, in this country and in other countries, that conversation is very progressive because, as a country, we've barely scratched the surface, let alone with understanding or even beginning to understand the experiences of women in other countries. In
Sure.
third world countries, we tend to automatically think that these women are eternally oppressed, and it's much more complex than that, as most things. And
Hmm.
there's definitely a lack of knowledge and discourse that reflects our own ignorance when we try to impose our own postmodern feminism in these countries, when really, like, it should be transnational, it should be inclusive.
It should be. I think just going back to the idea of seeing women and children as the only entities, by focusing on a single entity instead of the family as a single entity or even the community as a single entity, we fall into the trap of only seeing women as domestic workers
Hmm.
and the ones who take care of the family. And we always fall back into this because we don't see the community as a single entity, and we don't see that the community can influence these smaller entities.
Yeah,
Instead, we focused on the individual and individualism, which is part and parcel of Western ideology.
absolutely.
Eastern ideologies have this community orientation, but but there's less research regarding this Eastern lens, and based on these perspectives in relation to maternity leave and maternity support.
Absolutely. Yeah. um, we have much more still to talk about, but we will be touching more on not just maternity leave, and what healthcare looks like in the different working sectors in our next episode. So, again, thank you all for listening. Tune in to our next episode of Caring for Mothers Around the World to learn more about this fascinating and very, very relevant topic. Thank you.
Thank you.